Today's competitive overview is about Azelf. I believe that's how you pronounce it. It is part of that legendary trio of psychic types, mono psychic types, which is not really the greatest typing in the world to have access to. Offensively, you have super effectives on fighting and poison, while steel and psychic resist this offense, and dark is immune to it entirely. So while it is relatively okay, the resist spread is actually slightly worse than that of, say, normal type, which also has a typing immune to it combined with two typings that resist it. And defensively, the typing is fine. We have super effectives from Bug, Ghost, and Dark, while it does resist Psychic and Fighting, which you can pretty much ignore Bug type offense in a VGC format. Bug is very uncommon as an offensive option. Ghost and Dark, however, are actually pretty common. So if you want to cover both Ghost and Dark, you'll have to run Dark as your defensive Terra type. But some other decent options for defensive or even offensive Terra types, something like Fire or Electric, could also work quite well with this Pokemon. The entire trio of these would benefit from similar options as well. But if you were to run Electric or Fire Terra type, it would synergize quite well with Levitate, which gives you that very nice ground type immunity. So if you did run Electric Terra type, you would actually not have a weakness, as long as you're not fighting a Mold Breaker Pokemon that has a ground type move. Now, all of the trio have 580 base stats, but Azelf specifically is the offensive variant. So we have relatively mediocre bulk on this, being 75 hit points, 70 on both defense and speed up, but the offense is actually quite high, being 125 on both stats. The speed stat is actually pretty good as well at 115. And while that will be slower than Pokemon like Roaring Moon or Chien-Pao, it is faster than some other options such as Mousehold, Screamtail, Thundurus, and Tornadus, the I forms. It's faster than those. That's faster than both Landorus forms. Faster than Jumpluff, and yeah, it's faster than Enamorus as well. And while that's a pretty good speed stat to work with, there are still scenarios where it is going to struggle a little bit in certain matchups, such as against Fluttermane, which absolutely one-hits this thing with a Shadow Ball. And Azelf does not return the favor very well at all, at least with the moves that I selected here. This is a 252 Timid variant. Same spread as the Picolytic set Fluttermane, actually. So with an offensive item, you could get more offense on this, but its Fluttermane matchup is pretty bad, actually. And even its Amoonguss matchup is interesting. So we have Mystical Power, which I'm going to get into later. That is actually a new option that these Pokemon have access to. It is a guaranteed to hit onto Amoonguss, but the Pollen Puff from Amoonguss, with no special attack investment, by the way, is also a guaranteed 2-hit onto Azelf. So offensively, we're not actually looking at that great of a scenario here. This is just the normal Picolytic set. If this were a max special defense build, these calculations would probably not be nearly as favorable for Azelf. But even with that in mind, that threat of 2-hit knockout with Pollen Puff on a defensive Pokemon is kind of an issue, and shows just how squishy Azelf is, which can limit some of its potential, definitely. But the reason I'm talking about Azelf and not the other two is because of its synergy with Mystical Power. It has the highest special attack stat, so it pairs very well with this new move that is a 70 power, 90 accuracy special attack that raises the user's special attack. So think Torch Song with slightly worse stats and psychic typing. So if you combined this with the rather high 125 special attack stat, you really only need one boost to set up some pretty serious offense on this Pokemon. So if we give a special attack boost, the offense is still not super great into something like Fluttermane, but now we are threatening some really nice offense onto Amoonguss, with the potential for a one-hit knockout using Mystical Power. But if you were running an offensive Terra type, such as Fire, then your Flamethrower would be a guaranteed one-hit KO onto Amoonguss, after getting that special attack boost from Mystical Power. So played correctly, there are scenarios you can get Azelf set up, because Mystical Power is a setup move that also puts on a decent amount of offense, which is never a bad option. You do just have to keep in mind that it is only 90 accurate, so that chance of missing that could throw your entire plans out the window is definitely there. Now, if you want to play it with other psychic type offense, it does get psychic as well as future sight and extra sensory. It does also get stored power and psi shock if you want to hit on the physical side, which if you're running psi shock, your matchup into Fluttermane becomes a lot more interesting, especially if you have speed control set up to where Azelf will be faster than Fluttermane when it shows up on the battlefield. And if you do manage to get a stage up of special attack, then Azelf can threaten Fluttermane with a one-hit knockout with Psi Shock. So that is an option to definitely consider and might be more flexible than running an additional coverage move. Speaking of coverage moves, this Pokemon does get access to a good bit of them. It gets a lot of punches like the elemental punches as well as drain punch. It does have a U-turn as well. There is also Shadow Ball if you want to threaten super effective offense into Fluttermane, though I think Psi Shock technically works better into Fluttermane than Shadow Ball does, and there are some less consistent options like Thunder and Fire Blast, as well as the ones I showed earlier that are, very good options in general: Flamethrower, Thunderbolt, Energy Ball. Your Fairy type offense is either Play Rough or Dazzling Gleam. I guess Dazzling Gleam is an okay option, but it's not a super high amount of offense, so I don't think Fairy Terra type is going to be your best choice as far as offense goes. And it does get Zen Headbutt if you want to run this like physical, which would be kind of odd. I don't know if a physical Azelf is really the best option to go for. Now, for supportive moves, this gets Imprison, as well as Detect, Nasty Plot, Endure, several of the Weathers, Screens, Metronome for shenanigans, Thunder Wave, Taunt, Skill Swap, Trick, even Stealth Rock, interesting. Encore, Calm Mind, Helping Hand, Baton Pass, I think I already mentioned Nasty Plot, and even Trick Room, which I believe all of these share a very similar moveset, aside from their level up moves. So for the more defensively built of the trio, something like Trick Room would make a lot of sense. But this is the offensive one, so maybe Helping Hand could be quite useful. That or like Nasty Plot if you predict you can actually get that off. But Mystical Power is actually a little easier to set up because it is an attack. So the reason I'm talking about Azelf specifically and not really the other two is because the other two have a lot less of a point when Cresselia is going to be in the same format as them. Cresselia plays the defensive supportive role considerably better than any of these do, especially now that it has access to Lunar Dance and Lunar Blessing. Azelf, however, still has a unique role in that it is a pretty good special sweeper. Though its viability against something like Fluttermane is maybe not the greatest, it does still have a good enough speed stat that you can really work with it and get it set up to be quite effective in the right scenario. So Tailwind works really well with Azelf, I think, because with Tailwind being so prevalent right now to speed up particular Pokemon, Azelf's speed stat is good enough to work well in a Tailwind setting, because there's not too many things faster than it, and if you do have an additional speed control option, you could speed control something like Fluttermane or Chien-Pao to prevent them from blowing this thing up, even though it doesn't match very well into either of those, which is definitely something to consider. It's kind of squishy though, on both physical and special. Squishy enough for Amoonguss to 2-hit it with Pollen Puff, which is not good, and that definitely brings its viability down some, because there are already a lot of other offensive options that aren't trying to rely on any kind of setup from, say, Mystical Power to get a high amount of offense out. The offensive stat is pretty good though, and if you have a super effective onto something that's relatively squishy, you have a good chance of one-hitting it, especially if you have a Terra type that synergizes with your coverage move. And while Levitate's not maybe the most broken ability out there, it does help with your matchup into something like Ursaluna or Landorus. But even though Mystical Power is a handy buff for it and gives it another option to set up without having to use Calm Mind, there is still the issue of it being quite squishy, as well as there just being other offensive options that are a bit more effortless in their utility. So I would put Azelf somewhere in the B to C tier area, because it does have enough options to be quite strong. It just takes you getting the utility of this Pokemon out reliably. which is really why some of these Pokemon that have good capacity don't ever become commonplace in the format. The A and S tier Pokemon are ones that don't require as much effort to get out their good options, like Amoonguss, which threatens Spore and has Regenerator to keep it healthy when you're switching it out all the time. That's very easy to utilize. And there are just other offensive options like Fluttermane, Chien-Pao, Basculegion, Iron Bundle. Things like that are a lot easier to work with and are often preferred to Pokemon like this because their utility is just easier to get off. That being said, you could still get some very nice wins with Azelf. It's just going to take more effort than some of the stronger Pokemon in the format. That's enough about Azelf. If there's a Pokemon you want me to cover for either competitive speculation or competitive overview such as Azelf, let me know down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, then be sure to give it a like or any of the other YouTube algorithm food buttons. You should know where those are. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time.